going to be a very hard talk to give because it comes at the end of everyone else's economics talks. And it's going to sound like I'm being critical, but I promise I'm not criticizing anybody here's talk specifically or anything like that, or any presentations. So basically, this is just a rundown. We're going to look at why we value studies on value for recreational fisheries, how we've done it in typical ways, and then some of the potential misrepresentations I think that we're putting across to policymakers and other people, and then sort of somebody's head's in the way. Some of the use scenarios for each of the methodologies that we do use. But again, this is a huge disclaimer. I'm not attacking anybody's study here. This is not based on some sort of a meta-analysis. Someone already did that 20 years ago, and they talked about these same exact topics. But I have experienced a lot of the same issues, reading literature at conferences, and having worked on both sides of the table for rulemaking and academia pushing for rulemaking, I can still say that a lot of these misrepresentations are still occurring today. So why do we typically assess, economic contributions or anything that has to do with economics in recreational fisheries? Well, recreational fisheries are socio-ecological systems. Economics falls very squarely in that socio side of the socio-ecological system. But the main reasons are that we're trying to maybe create more legitimacy around recreational fisheries. We want, recreational fisheries lie within, the competition for the allocation of scarce resources. So we want to try and show that, we're relevant too. We try to justify budgets. If these things are generating a lot of money, then maybe more budget should be allocated to their management or growing them. But ultimately, we need to know, if we're going to implement policies, what are the potential impacts on people? And at the end of the day, we can understand certain social benefits outside of economic value as well, but just the local connection to it. But, as Steve was saying during his plenary, a huge reason for looking into economics is that advocacy sort of perspective of just making us, giving us a big chair in the room so that we can also get representation. So we often show these big numbers because we know that influence policy or protect access to fisheries. But at the end of the day, even in the literature, even in a lot of presentations, what we see is that these economic studies are mostly used for advocacy. Here's the study that really helps lay out, some of the uses and misuses of these sort of economic studies. So when we look at some of the typical methods that we use for, economic studies within recreational fisheries, a lot of them start with expenditure-based, where we just look at what is the consumer spending within recreational fisheries, what are they spending it on. That includes tackle, gear, food and beverage, trip costs, and so on. And then we have things like, which have mostly been presented here, which are the input-output models, where we can look at, the direct impacts, and I'll put that in quotes for now, indirect ones, which look at how it kind of flows through the value chains, and then some induced effects, which talk about how, for every unit of currency spent, how that sort of recirculates through the economy and gradually loses value throughout that, but that's complicated. So we also can look at potentially the output, and when we look at output, we're not talking about how much fishery production is happening in recreational fisheries. We're talking about supported output because these purchases are supporting output from other sectors. Recreational fisheries spans multiple sectors, so that's what we're talking about there, the supported jobs and the supported GDP. We look at things like consumer surplus through willingness to pay studies, and this can be some stated preference, where we literally are just asking what the willingness to pay is. You can use discrete choice experiments, and so on. Then we look at travel cost methods, which Wendy sort of presented a little bit on that earlier, which kind of just looks at how far people are willing to travel and what is the value of that. We look at social accounting matrices, which is very similar to input-output models, but a bit more regional. And we look at tourism satellite accounts if we want to actually look at the general share of GDP that recreational fisheries can sort of represent. But if we really want impact, the word impact, we use CGE models, but that requires requires incredibly complex data because humans are incredibly complex people who can substitute recreational fishing with literally anything, including changing their hobby to throwing a stick into a bush if they want it. I don't know. So that's that. Next one. But so most things, most of the studies that are currently taking place, though, fall within these expenditure surveys, and then are plugged into input-output models. Okay, so I just want to weigh in on the terminology because this is where things are getting a bit fuzzy in this interdisciplinary field. When we look at some of the definitions of these economic terms, you can see how they can potentially be misused. So when we say things like impact, what do we actually mean? And if you look at the literature, what comes across is we're talking about economic benefit, which would be like consumer surplus. We're looking at economic activity, which means we're following those flows throughout the economy for everything that's spent in recreational fishing. When we talk about economic contribution, same kind of idea. But when we're talking about economic impact, we want to know if recreational fishing doesn't exist, what is the actual cost of that? If there's no substitution, there's no alternative, what is the impact of recreational fisheries? So where we're crossing these lines, it's really complicated. So what economic impact actually is that amount of money that is new to an area that only will exist if there's recreational fishing. So impact should only include maybe spending by foreign fisheries tourists, because if they were coming there specifically only for fishing, you can say, if there's no fishing here, those tourists aren't going to come here and they're not going to spend money. That constitutes economic impact. So foreign tourists, out-of-region visitors, if you're looking at regional models. And then if you can somehow figure out the import substitution, which would be very complicated for leisure activities, and you can look at the literature that has tried and really struggled, there's that. So but at the end of the day, when we're talking about economic impact, the unfortunate thing is the reality is that economic impact is going to be significantly lower than we're representing it with things like economic contribution, total economic value, and so on. So maybe the term economic impact, like impact sounds great, it motivates people because when you hear impact, you think that is actually the value of the fishery, right? That is actually what this contributes directly to us only because of its existence. But in reality, people, if fishing doesn't exist, are likely to take up soccer. Maybe if you're Warren Potts, you'll dedicate more time to reviewing your co-authorship papers. So there's those options. So when we use these terms interchangeably, we inevitably confuse policymakers, and we don't want to do that because then they start asking a lot more questions from their stats people, from the national accounts people, and then critics start attacking the numbers, because remember, we are sometimes lobbying these numbers so that we can position ourselves against resource competitors. And they are very likely to come back and say that is a very big misrepresentation of the actual value of the fishery. And then when we start comparing ourselves to various other sectors, whether it's mining, whether it's other forms of ecotourism, whether it's commercial fisheries, those arguments become really weak, and ultimately the science that we spent so much effort on and putting forth becomes incredibly weak. Now, I'm not saying that those input-output models are indefensible. I'm not saying that any other methods are indefensible. I'm saying our terminology around it and maybe our goals for what we're trying to accomplish with them may need a bit more refinement. So when we look at what these input-output models, and I'm bringing this up because these are typically the most used in these studies, what they actually are for is for sort of just tracking money through the economy and tracking spending. And it was originally established to simulate how a change in spending creates a change in basically in output or incomes and changes in employment. So it was meant to track. So if you picture a cake, for instance, we know that if you put more recreational fishing ingredients into it, that cake will grow. If you take some out, it'll shrink. But it doesn't really give us any idea how or why. But it's useful for certain economic development because we are tracking things through certain value chains. So we can say, this sector could use some additional support, and it could increase or retain value in local areas, and so on. It also helps compare various spending But at the end of the day, it is not economic impact. It cannot be economic impact because it doesn't account for substitution in an adequate manner. And yeah, that's pretty much the main thing. You have to be able to account for if there's no fishing, do people just hold on to their money and do nothing? But also there's other items included in these metrics like food and beverage. If recreational fishing doesn't exist, people don't stop eating and drinking and so on. So it's complicated to use the word economic impact there. So it can't tell you economic welfare or benefit. That's essentially consumer surplus. You'd have to ask some other questions for that. It cannot tell you contribution to GDP because it's not directly a contribution to GDP unless you've worked out some gross value added equation to do so. And it can't really predict long-term adjustments. And essentially it can't tell you economic impact aside from revenue generation for fisheries tourism because there's no substitution for that. So what I think we actually want to know when we're talking about the economics of recreational fisheries, because I think a lot of times, this is a very multidisciplinary area. A lot of the time it's fisheries managers, fisheries researchers, who aren't economists, who know that this is a very important topic, so they go to an economist and they say, we need economics work on recreational fisheries. And an economist goes, got you. But no one really knows what they mean by we need economics work. But I think one of the main things that we are talking about is we want to show how relevant we are in terms of our contribution to GDP, because that's how all the other sectors are kind of getting their relevance in national accounts, which is then budget allocation and so on. And so to do that, remember recreational fishing is not a production sector, so it's very difficult to do gross value added in a traditional manner. It's essentially linked to a tourism activity. So we need to figure out how we're going to calculate gross value added for a sector like recreational fisheries. In typical national accounts, gross value added for production kind of sectors involves looking at the production value minus intermediate costs. So you look at, in commercial fisheries, the landed value of fish minus whatever the costs were involved in that other than employment and that, because that's part of gross value added. So that's just an example up there, not really that relevant. But recreational fisheries don't produce fish, so how are we going to calculate gross value added? And the answer is TSA. And I'm not talking about the people who steal shit out of your bags in the US. I'm talking about tourism satellite accounts. So recreational fisheries, again, tourism activity, and tourism is valued by national accounts as its own sector, and they use the measure of tourism satellite accounts. So basically it involves the same expenditure surveys that you'll do for things like input-output models or just looking at expenditures in general. So you have access to that data, which you can then take to use for input-output models as well if you wanted to. And then it allocates a share of your sectoral value to the added demand that it creates. And you can estimate basically the direct gross value added attributable to fishing tourism by looking at the tourism satellite accounts and kind of easily calculating that. But you do have to use some caution with it because, again, local anglers will not be measured in the same way because the local anglers, their expenditure usually will occur in that region no matter what. So, yeah, you have to exclude typical daily purchases like food and beverage and so on. So, at the end of the day, this also still cannot tell us economic impact. And it also, we still know nothing about substitution effects. So if we're targeting impact, if we really want impact, and the utility of that is that if we want to have an area closure or a seasonal closure or a permanent closure of a fishery, we can potentially track down what are place an economic value on the change of that specific policy. So we need to, in order to do that, though, we need an incredibly thorough understanding of human behavior and the preferences for various alternatives around recreational fisheries. And once we have all of that detail, and I'll explain about how much detail that requires, which is an insane amount, you can develop yourself a computable general equilibrium model. If you remember chasing the fish. I don't remember which way it went. But that is fundamentally a very, like a predator-prey model, is a very basic sort of CGE model. So the gold standard for this, though, it requires, input-output tables. It requires the calculation of gross value added. It requires information about household income and spending, various government accounts. It requires trade data. It requires savings and investment data. We need to really dig into the substitution data, and then other behavioral response data. So, and behavioral response data I'm referring to there is how people make shifts in their daily behavior based on other shifts in daily behavior. It's very complicated. So it's currently impractical for recreational fisheries because there is really, really, really limited data in this space. This is like a highly untapped human dimension space. So I think we should probably change that. I think we need to start digging into some of these things. I think substitution is a massive thing we should look at. Okay, if recreational fisheries don't exist, what will people actually do? How do we track that? And the problem with that is that it'll probably change day to day as well. So it's really complicated. But when we get that sort of information, I think then we can kind of work towards something greater. So today, this isn't just a critique of current economic studies in recreational fisheries. This is a bit of a plea for help. It's a call for all researchers to sort of come together and think about whether or not we should start some sort of an economic working group where we can discuss key performance economic indicators of recreational fisheries. We can establish frameworks for the valuation of them, and we can work together so that we have comparable assessments across the globe. And when we say things, we mean them. So if you are interested, I'm happy to organize this whole group and maybe even see where it goes. But you can see me after this talk, or you can email me. And honestly, I think the conversation around this needs to continue, and we need to really think about how we can improve the way we approach economic studies and the way that we present them to the people that need to hear them. So thank you very much.